Good morning, and thank you very much, Angela. I'm campaigning for a reform of the system of suicide risk assessment. I would like to say a heartfelt thanks to Lewis Appleby and his team. Lewis has been unstinting in his support and encouragement for my campaign, and we should all be grateful to him for the humanity and insight he brings to his invaluable work on suicide prevention. I want to say one thing up front to all of you attending today. Please do not use suicide risk stratification, stratifying suicide risk into low, medium, or high. NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, stated very clearly in their September 2022 guidance, do not use risk stratification. Instead, please use a holistic psychosocial approach to assessing suicide risk, where the focus is on understanding the patient's needs and developing a therapeutic relationship rather than completing a checklist. Can we have the first slide, please? This was my son, Tom. Tom had a very happy childhood. My mother used to say, there are so many people who love Tom, and she was right. He was confident, outgoing, had lots of friends, did well academically at school and university. He loved sports, especially football, and he spoke 3 languages fluently. He wanted to be a teacher because he wanted to do some good in the world. Tom took his own life in July 2020, the day after he was assessed as low risk of suicide. At first, I thought he was one of the unlucky ones, the exception to the rule. But I was utterly shocked to discover that Tom was not the exception. He was the rule. Can we have the second slide, please? Of the 17 people who take their own lives every day in the UK, 5 are in contact with mental health services, and 4 of those 5, that is 80%, are assessed as low or no risk at their last contact. These figures are taken from NCISH, and the 5 and 4 figures include only NHS data. Excuse me. I've included my email address, mail@philippirie.com, and Twitter handle on the slide, and would welcome any comments on this talk in the chat or direct, especially if you don't agree with me. This so-called low-risk paradox, the 4 of the 5, has been known about for over 25 years. On a conservative calculation, over 30,000 people have taken their own lives in that period, having been in contact with mental health services and been assessed as low or no risk of suicide. It is entirely plausible to think that thousands of those people's lives could have been saved if they had been assessed properly. I felt very angry when I found out about how long the low-risk paradox had been known about and how little seemingly had been done about it. But I didn't want to stand on the touchline criticizing the players on the field. I wanted to try and up my game, see if I could get on the team and help score some goals. Tom's suicide risk assessment consisted of 3 simple questions. Question 1, do you have suicidal thoughts? Tom answered yes. Question 2, do you have any intentions to take your own life? Tom answered, no. Question 3, do you have any plans to take your own life? Tom answered, no. Solely on the basis of Tom's answers to these 3 crude questions, Tom was consistently assessed as low risk of suicide. I know this from the counsellor's witness statements to Tom's inquest. I've thought a lot about what might have been going on in Tom's mind in those counselling sessions. Knowing Tom, it would have been a big deal to disclose his suicidal thoughts at all, like many men, I'm sure. He was in a very unfamiliar situation, and he may well have been afraid of being sectioned, being judged, or being stigmatized. I suspect he was also feeling the temperature of the water with his counsellors, seeing how they would react. He probably then felt dismissed when his counsellor didn't explore his suicidal thoughts, but moved on to other things. In this way, perhaps the counsellor's avoidance was an example of the stigma of suicide. The counsellor may have felt relieved by the mistaken low assessment and changed the subject. So the checklist would have acted as a barrier rather than as an enabler of necessary exploration. Now, here's the first thing. There is no evidence supporting the validity of this type of checklist, which the Royal College of Psychiatrists has described as fundamentally flawed. And here's the second thing. Those invalid checklists have been taught for many years at training institutions. And here's the third thing. Many mental health trusts and private sector organizations have required and still require their practitioners to carry out these invalid assessments. Thus has bad practice become embedded in the system of suicide risk assessment. To my mind, there is a massive and unjustified assumption underlying the use of questions like these. That is, that the patient is going to answer openly and truthfully. I believe that assumption to be extraordinarily naive for the reason I have mentioned above about Tom's fears and his feeling his way with his counsellors, seeing whether he could trust them. I would like you all to note that there was a big discrepancy between what Tom wrote in his diary and what his counsellors reported. I put this down to the lack of a trusting therapeutic relationship which Tom felt he could be frank and open. It is impossible to ignore the stark contrast between the validation of new medical interventions for physical health and the validation of new psychological interventions for mental health. New physical health interventions require rigorous, tried and tested, double-blind trials. Mental health interventions require nothing by way of validation, although some interventions, such as some CBT-based interventions, have been validated. I'm sure those introducing new mental health interventions have the best intentions, but there are far too many psychological interventions in widespread use today that have received no validation whatsoever. That needs to change. Sir Isaac Newton adopted the scientific method over 300 years ago, and frankly, it's high time the psychological professions caught up. Can you please take this slide down? Can you take that slide down, please? Can you please take this? Thank you. I'm sure most, if not all of you, recognize something in my description of the crude checklist. Thankfully, things are beginning to change. In the summer of 2022, the chief coroner wrote to all coroners, pointing out that NICE guidance dating back to 2011 stated that risk assessment tools and scales should not be used to predict suicide. In September 2022, NICE updated their guidance and issued NG 225, which says, do not use risk stratification, stratifying risk into low, medium, or high. Coroners have a legal obligation to write a prevention of future death report if facts arising in the course of an inquest arouse their concerns. And they should be concerned whenever they see risk stratification, which will prompt them to write prevention of future death reports. What the chief coroner says can make a big difference. If there is anyone on this webinar from the chief coroner's office, may I please ask them to update their letter to coroners to reflect the latest NICE guidance. This will help save lives. In October 2022, Professor Tim Kendall, then National Clinical Director for Mental Health at NHS England, wrote to all mental health trusts, repeating the updated NICE guidance. He told them, do not use risk stratification to assess suicide risk. Do not try to predict suicide risk, and do not use risk stratification to determine treatment. This was followed up by Dr. Adrian Whittington, National Clinical Lead for the Psychological Professions for NHS England, writing to all psychological professions such as BACP and UKCP, saying the same thing. Do not use suicide risk stratification. For the avoidance of doubt, NICE guidelines apply to both public and private health sectors. I mention this because, shockingly, some private sector mental health associations were not aware that NICE guidelines apply to the private as well as the public mental health sectors. Some organizations move more quickly than others. Some are keen to learn and change, and some are more resistant to change. On the 28th of March this year, the Professional Standards Authority, the regulator of the private sector mental health registers, completed their targeted review of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, BACP. I'm sure there are many BACP members present here today. BACP is by far the largest register with 66,000 registrants. The PSA found that BACP's guidance to its members in dealing with suicidal clients was inadequate and did not comply with NICE guideline NG 225. The PSA made renewal of BACP's accreditation conditional on them doing three things. Can we have the third slide, please? Can we have the third slide up, please? Thank you. Condition 1 requires BACP to have an independent expert revise their inadequate guidance to members on dealing with suicidal clients. Condition 2 requires BACP to disseminate the new guidance to all members. Condition 3 requires BACP to demonstrate to the PSA that all training courses accredited by them comply with NICE guidance. These conditions have to be satisfied by the end of June. In the spirit of cooperation, I'll be asking Phil James, BACP's new chief executive, for a meeting to discuss these and other issues. I want to come back to the 1754. Can we have slide 2 again, please? Many of you work in the private sector, and many work in both the private and NHS sectors. Now, here's a strange thing. The 5 of the 17 who are in contact with mental health services, and the 4 of those 5 who are assessed as low or no risk of suicide, include only NHS data. They do not include private sector data. So whereas the 17 is a firm figure deriving ultimately from coroner's inquests, the 5 could be 6, 7, 8, or a higher number, and so could the 4 when you include private sector data. To put these unknowns into some perspective, there are 85,000 private registrants. So there is a big gap in our knowledge that needs to be filled. The inadequacy of BACP's guidance to its members on dealing with suicidal patients reinforces the need to get a handle on private sector data as soon as possible. I am pleased that the PSA, the regulator, recognizes the importance of having complete data on suicides and will be working with the private registers and NCISH to support that goal. Tom had been seeing a private counselor. So when he took his own life on the 11th of July, 2020, he was not included in the 5 and the 4 for that day. Tom would now be 30 years old. His suicide was not just an indescribable loss to all those who loved him. It was also a loss to wider society, to whom he had so much to contribute. Tom kept a journal up to the day he took his own life, and it was heartbreaking to read about the demons that finally got the better of him. It is almost unbearable to think about the profound joy that Tom brought to all those who loved him, and compare that to the unendurable suffering that Tom went through, ending that suffering in the only way he knew how. Tom's suffering and the suffering of the far too many like him need to be recorded in the data. Thank you.
Philip, thank